Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, so we are back with Chapter 10, Singular Creed. I've tried to get as many of these done as I can, and we'll continue on. The founder of the new Puritan sect was a shiftless and indolent young man of 25 who had run through a host of occupations with consistent lack of success. He was of humble origin and lacked formal schooling, but he had a striking presence and was a compelling orator and resourceful leader. In short, he was a charismatic figure of unusual power. His daring, or rashness, as a strategist was matched by an unfailing sense of showmanship and dramatic effect. As king and absolute ruler of the community, he paraded his capital, borne on a white charger, resplendent in magnificent uniform, with the sword of the empire. As a prophet of God, he was vouchsafed revelations from on high, and thereby enabled to restore the church to its original purity. The community of saints founded by him was to usher in the New Jerusalem, the second coming of Christ, and the millennium. It was fiercely exclusive and regarded all outsiders, the Gentiles, as assuredly damned. The faithful were mostly drawn from the poorer classes and set their faces firmly against official upper-class culture and attitudes. The new religion provided a set of principles on the basis of which not only personal conduct, but a whole social order was organized. The group's way of life was communitarian and egalitarian, as in the early church, and austerely patriarchal in its sexual ethics. After a time, the prophet announced that polygamy was a divine command, the aim of which was to raise up righteous seed to inherit the earth. There was some initial opposition, which was soon overcome. The saints' fanaticism had never made them popular. The profession of polygamy caused a wave of revulsion and led to the death of the prophet and to the elimination of this particular doctrine. The leader I have described in this passage is not, as might be imagined, John of Leyden, but Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormons. However, the portrait might be of either figure, and indeed the analogies between them are so numerous and so startling that it would be simple to make an account of the Mormons follow this parallelism. Let me read that again. And indeed, the analogies between them are so numerous and so startling that it would be simple to make an account of the Mormons follow this parallelism. Simply but misleading, for history may repeat itself, but it is never cut to exactly the same pattern. Joseph Smith came of Puritan stock, and he was raised in a revivalist region of New York State, the burned out district. But he does not breathe fire and brimstone. If he absorbed anything from these early influences, it was a visionary turn of mind rather than an inclination to asceticism. Indeed, he would readily have subscribed to the definition of Mormon Moors in one of P.G. Wodehouse's novels as, quote, the jolliest life on earth, unquote. And he would have been even more enthusiastic in endorsing the view that bigamy, quote, was merely the normal result of a generous nature striving to fulfill itself, unquote. He was a right jolly prophet, said one of Joseph's friends. He used to laugh from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, shook every bit of flesh in him. He had a refreshingly unprophetic gift of being able to laugh at himself, and his bent for occasional comedy disconcerted those who expected a patriarchal solemnity. He was, in short, a regular fellow, tall and powerfully built. He loved a scrap, occasionally got drunk, and showed the most perfunctory repentance for his errors. And his vitality was prodigious. It found its outlet not in so much in basic physical performances as in the creation of a new, dynamic, and ingenious theology and ethos. The essence of that religion was that, quote, men are that they might have joy, unquote. It is no accident that his first written profession of polygamous love begins with an expression of the same conviction. Quote, happiness is the object and design of our existence, unquote. And happiness was to be obtained in large measure through the body. Joseph was convinced, as one critic puts it, quote, of the thorough goodness of the flesh, unquote. He made no secret of the irresistible attraction he felt for and exercised on women. Whenever I see a pretty woman, he is reported to have said, I have to pray for grace. And to another friend, he confessed, if the Lord had not taken me in hand, I would have become the greatest whoremonger in the land. Grace must indeed have been granted, for no serious scandal is imputed to him till 1835. In part, this may have been due to his marriage to Emma Hale in January 1827, when he had just turned 21. Even so, for someone with this powerful sex drive, the unblotted record of his early manhood is surprising. No doubt the fear of the Lord played his part, but a much more effective influence seems to have been the fear of Smith's lady, the redoubtable Emma, who was not a woman to be trifled with. In 1835, Fanny Alger, an attractive 17-year-old orphan whom the Smiths had taken into their home, became pregnant. There was a little doubt. There was little doubt as to the identity of the father. The girl was driven out, and there were stormy scenes in the household. Emma refused to sanction Joseph's amours. And the prophet's only comeback, rather a weak one, was to appeal to all wives to obey their husbands. The lesson of the incident was not lost on Joseph. He had once confided to a friend, quote, God does not mind if we have a good time, provided nobody knows about it, unquote. But in the absence of effective birth control methods, procreation will out. The prophet, therefore, logically enough, turned his attention to married women where it was much easier to avoid exposure. The list of his marriages prepared by Fawn Brodie in her masterly biography, pages 335 to 6, shows that up until the end of June 1842, his 13 known affairs, with two exceptions, were with married women. There was no problem of supply. Kirtland, the Ohio town where the Mormons first settled, was overflowing with women who idolized him, both as their religious leader and as a commanding personality. But his careful policy was subsequently discarded. From 1840, he instructed his closest disciples in strict confidence in the doctrine of plural marriages. He had flirted with the idea of adopting polygamy since 1835, if not earlier, the year not only of his affair with Fanny Alger, but also of the first rumors accusing the Mormons of polygamy and of the church's first of many denials. Reader's note here. I did know a little bit about the misdeeds of Joseph Smith. And of course, if we look at the biblical narrative dispassionately, and especially the law, we see that these women had active husbands. They claimed them, they wanted them, and they may have been underlings. And so he used power of position and secrecy to satiate his incredible sexual drive, it appears, and committed adultery with a number of them. So obviously he's going to stand in judgment for that. And perhaps many other things, but it appears that there was a shift to where he realized that that was ill behavior, and perhaps his conscience got the best of him, and he begins to then formulate this notion of plural marriage, such that perhaps that it would not be married women, but that it would be a formalized doctrine, which would then allow him to take single women. Although I have heard in some accounts that he continued this perfidious practice of taking married women secretly. But let's see what it says. But while enjoining complete secrecy on the matter, Joseph did not seem to have steered them in the direction of already married women, rather the reverse, and he did not counsel them to avoid siring children outside their official wedlock. What was even more serious, he was himself at the latter date to jettison his prudence and extend his circle of plural wives to include maidens as well. It was inevitable that word of the secret marriages should leak out, especially when the proffers of polygamy was rejected. One case in particular created a great stir because it involved no less a person than Brigham Young, who was to lead the Mormons across America to Utah and rule them over for some 30 years. In the spring of 1842, he tried to convert the new doctrine a high-spirited 18-year-old English girl called Martha Brotherton. She reacted coolly to his courtship and asked for time to reflect. She was allowed to go home to her parents, where she unburdened herself. The scandal was at once broadcast far and wide. When the storm broke, Brigham Young called the story a lie, and both the girl's brother-in-law and her two sisters, notes Brodie, were persuaded to swear that she was not only a liar but a harlot. Joseph, for his part, also made a bid early in the same year for the hand of Nancy Rigdon, the attractive 19-year-old daughter of one of the Mormon leaders, who, however, had not been initiated into polygamy. As ill luck would have it, Joseph had a rival. One of his favorite associates, Dr. John C. Bennett, had also cast his eye on Nancy. Bennett had a very detached conception of polygamy and used it without even the veneer of religious sanction applied by Joseph. Moreover, he was an instructor in midwifery and practiced abortion on a fairly large scale, and he knew a good deal more than was healthy about Smith's own carefully crafted plural marriage. Or rather, let me read that again. And he knew a good deal more than was healthy about Smith's own carefully concealed plural marriages. Bennett forewarned Nancy of Joseph's intentions. Thus prepared, the girl met the prophet's exhortation with tears and abuse, finally threatening to scream until the whole town came running unless he let her go home. The next day, Joseph made the mistake of dictating a letter to her, which, after the preamble about happiness already quoted, expatiated on the nature of God's commandments, adduced the example of Solomon, to whom God granted every desire of his heart, and insisted that things which to this incompletely enlightened might seem abominable were in reality right, because God sanctioned them by special revelation. Nancy showed the compromising note to her father, who immediately taxed Joseph with immorality. Soon the scandal was public. Coming so soon after the Brotherton debacle, this affair set the cat among the pigeons. Joseph had no option but to denounce Bennett as a profligate and to cut him off from the church in June. The doctor's exposure of his former friends, the history of the saints, was defined by the New York Herald as obscene and licentious in the highest degree. This is a fair description. The book paints a lurid picture of the organization of Mormon women into three classes. There were first the Cyprian saints. These were the lowest category who, quote, had been betrayed into the indiscretion and forced to confess, and who therefore were designated as harridans for the church leaders. The second group was the chambered sisters of charity, who were less prodigal of their charms. If the church official wished to win a chambered sister of charity, he asked Joseph, who looked in his peepstone, an instrument used by the prophet from the start, and then inquired the will of heaven. If he desired the woman for himself, the answer was no. Lastly, there were the cloistered saints, or saints of the black veil, who went through a marriage ritual and became secret or spiritual wives. Joseph had at least 7 of these. Readers know, I have read quite a bit about Joseph Smith and that religion. One of the curious things is that he had a wide brim hat. And he had this stone. He would put it in the bottom of the hat. He would turn it upside down and put his face completely into the void of the hat with it turned upside down in his hands. And he would make his determinations, his prognostications. He was quite a showman, and it's hard to imagine how people could be beguiled by it. But interestingly enough, he had quite a following doing these kinds of things. Continuing on. At this point, Bennett's account approaches reality, but in general, he discredits his revelations by his wild exaggeration. Had he taken a more sober line, he might well have brought the Mormon structure down in ruins. More lethal than his highly charged pornography was the appearance in Nauvoo, the Illinois town to which the Mormons moved in 1839, of a spate of fatherless children in the first month of 1842, the first fruits of the unavowed polygamy. The city seethed with indignation at this appalling moral laxity. To get to the root of the evil, the Female Relief Committee, under Emma's chairmanship, which had been set up in March 1842, was given inquisitorial powers. After Bennett's departure, the whole blame was conveniently laid at his door. But for a time, there was a consternation among the leaders. Joseph urged the committee to be wary of taking extreme measures and to make sure that the truth did not leak out. Quietly and efficiently married all the members of the committee, with the exception of a Miss Whitney, who was accorded him her 17-year-old daughter instead. The new bevy of wives thus acquired included no fewer than 5 unmarried girls, if the fairly mature Eliza Snow can be called. There were also 2 married women. It may be that, as a result of this maneuver, Joseph discovered the superior joys of unripe fruit, and appetite came from the eating. But it was more probable that the change was due to other reasons. It had been pointed out that he had no known polygamous progeny from previously unmarried girls, although Eliza Snow is reported to have been pregnant and to have lost the child when thrown downstairs by an irate Emma, who had caught Eliza and Smith embracing in their home. It may be that Bennett performed abortions on his behalf up to the clash in the spring of 1842. It is much more likely that the growing delight in marriage with girls was related to his union. In March of that same year, to Patty Sessions, the local midwife, a slim, wiry woman with hands admirably small for her work. The only weakness in this arrangement, or this, rather, let me read it again. The only weakness in this argument is that Joseph, also unbeknown to Patty, married the midwife's daughter so that he could hardly have resorted to Patty's services in the girl's case. Whatever the reasons, Joseph from then on flung caution to the winds. The floodgates of desire were open. By the time of his death in June of the following year, he had married a total of 48 additional wives, of whom as many as 20 were virgins. Most of the latter tended to be very young. Sometimes their age was as low as 15. His wives included 5 pairs of sisters. Six of the girl wives lived at various times in his home. They were often presented as his nieces. When an English visitor commented on their marked dissimilarity, the prophet smiled slyly, dug the foreigner in the ribs, and muttered, "Oh, the carnal mind, the carnal mind!" If by his new techniques Joseph was able to avoid, on the whole, the scandal of children being born by his polygamous wives, he still had to contend with Emma's opposition. The wives of other disciples had been won around fairly easily to the new doctrine. Not so Emma. She was made of sterner stuff. It was not till the spring of 1843 that he succeeded in convincing her of the inevitability of the new marriage system. She reluctantly agreed that he might take additional wives if she could do the choosing. After much hesitation, she selected 2 of the 4 girls living with them at the time, and the ceremony was performed on the 11th of May, 1843. Emmett had no idea that these girls, who were sisters, had already been married to Joseph some 2 months earlier. She later consented to her husband taking another pair of sisters, but thereafter she put her foot down. She may have suspected the existence of others, notes Brodie, but she can never have imagined that there were so many. It was to overcome Emma's continued resistance that Joseph, at his brother's prompting, wrote down the famous revelation on plural marriage on the 12th of July, 1843. After a long justification of polygamy on biblical grounds, Joseph went to the heart of the matter in a special commandment to Emma to, quote, receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph, unquote, and to, quote, cleave unto my servant Joseph and to none else, unquote. If she were unwilling to obey, she was threatened with destruction. If on the contrary she obeyed, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even as he hath said. However, there follows a cryptic exhortation, quote, that she stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer her, for I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all, as I did Abraham, unquote. This warning has been taken by some critics to mean that Joseph had held out polyandry as a bait to soften Emma's resentment. And indeed, Brodie quotes a statement dated 1842 to the effect that, quote, Emma Smith suggested that she be given William Law, a leading Mormon, as a spiritual husband, unquote. Reader's note here, this may have been how the ignoble practice of passing wives around from leader to leader within this really excessively corrupt way of doing things. And it's been such a mess. It's rightly been used as the example to basically minimize or delegitimize the principle itself. That means scripture allowing a man to have more than one wife. And he made such an incredible mess of it that it's easy to see how the detractors seized onto these horrific stories. And of course, the outcry was so great. The violence against the Mormons became so great. Joseph Smith lost his life in the process. It is incredible to consider how badly things can be done. I mean, he is really the pinnacle example of how badly, if you're going to live this principle, he did it excessively poorly. That's my opinion. I'm sure the opinion of many other men. You look at it dispassionately. Continuing on, whatever the truth of this matter, Smith's brother Hiram met with no success when he read the revelation to Emma. He had never been so abused by a woman, he reported. When finally she was shown the document itself, she dropped it into the fireplace and watched it burn with grim satisfaction. That was the end of any attempt to discuss the matter. After Joseph's death, Emma stayed on in Nouveau. It looks like Nauvoo. She had not followed the saints out west, but married a handsome Gentile, Major Bitterman, and spent the rest of her life running a lodging house. The revelation did not convince Emma, and it stirred up a hornet's nest in the Mormon High Council when read to it in August 1843. The leadership at once split into two bitterly hostile factions. Fuel was added to an already blazing fire by economic and personal grievances. In particular, Joseph had tried at various times to convert the wives of three of his opponents, Law, Foster, and Kimball, to his polygamous doctrines. The opposition group did not allow them to be intimidated. They bought a printing press, and on the 7th of June, 1844, they brought out the first number of their journal called the Nauvoo Expositor. It was all the more formidable because of its restrained tone. Its lead editorial exposed polygamy but gave no names, but it contained statements by 16 women who had testified that Joseph Smith and other Mormon leaders had attempted to betray them under the, quote, new and everlasting covenant doctrine. The paper also alleged that Joseph had set up an inner council of 50 over which he reigned as king. Joseph's reaction was to utter one more disingenuous denial of polygamy and to have the printing press smashed. Law and Foster fled to nearby Carthage and brought an action against the prophet for rioting. Joseph surrendered to arrest and decided to face trial in Carthage. There, while in prison, he and his brother Hiram and two others were lynched by the mob on the 27th of June, 1844. His downfall came not only from the supremely poor judgment exercised during the final crisis, but ultimately from the insoluble conflict aroused by the practice of secret polygamy, and particularly from his unsuccessful efforts to seduce the wives of some of his fellow Mormons. Under his leadership, the course of true polygamy never did run smooth. Reader's note here. This is an excellent analysis because when you think about the horrible manner in which he conducted himself, yeah, I think there's a saying down in the South. It's called being two-faced. And so one might wonder if Joseph had simply had the stones, pardon the expression, to simply come out and say, I believe this is a revelation directly from God, and we need to adopt it and let the things fall where they may. Basically, just let the consequences occur. It would have forced a far more honest uh, sequence of events, and he may not have been ended up being lynched in a jail. Now, he may have lost many followers, maybe he would have lost money, but I highly suspect if he'd have just been honest about it and maintained honesty and not taken other men's wives, setting up eternal enemies against him, uh, it may have continued on even to this day. So this is why, and I have mentioned this before, if the doctrine, which is like a raging fire, is to be propagated, it has to be done with ironclad control, and there have to be very strict moral guidelines. In particular, if a woman is married and that husband continues, in other words, he has not said, I am going to divorce you, and so on. If he has basically shows love to his wife and they are clearly married, then this kind of thing, what Joseph did, should never be tolerated. Okay, continuing on, Joseph's doctrines are fairly parallel to this practice, which, as we have tried to show, was inspired in general by very uncelestial motives. The saints' basic sacred text, the Book of Mormon, published early in 1830, repeatedly denounced polygamy, although the leaders tried to explain away this unfortunate pronouncement, but without much success. The doctrine of polygamy was then suggested and rationalized by the Old Testament model. There were there are reports of revelations of plural marriage to Joseph as early as 1831 and again in 1834. What is certain is that in 1835, as a result of an intensive study of Genesis, the prophet developed a considerable attachment concerning the holiness of monogamy. Later in the same year, he made a cryptic reference at a wedding to many things relative to marriage anciently. If he adduced any religious sanction for his seduction of Fanny Alger, it was undoubtedly the example of the patriarchs. When, however, he transferred his attentions to married women, a different kind of justification was needed. In such cases, he made his advances under cover of the spiritual wife philosophy. This was in the air at the time. Fanny Brodie notes that the perfectionist thinker Lovett began preaching the theory in New England in 1835. Joseph, with his extraordinary gift for absorbing contemporary influences, must have picked up the basic idea of the doctrine, even if he may never have heard, even if he may never have heard of Swedenborg, the Swedish thinker who elaborated it. His interest in it was presumably heightened by his first known entanglement with a married woman in 1838. The concept was admirably suited to such situations. It played down the importance of earthly marriages, which were often contracted for material reasons or under compulsion, and it placed the whole emphasis on marriages foreordained or consummated in heaven, celestial marriages. Without a perfect marriage, there is no peace, even in heaven. Swedenborg had written, and conversely, two souls which grew up together before life are bound to find each other again on earth. The doctrine was made to order for Joseph, since, as head of the priesthood, he had to approve marriages both on earth and in heaven before they were binding. He even had power to unbind. Hence, whenever he desired, he could release a woman from her existing marriage and thus eliminate any stigma of adultery. These powers are explicitly claimed and defined in the Revelation of 1843. Concerning adultery, it is declared in that document, if a woman is with another man, And if she hath not committed adultery, but is innocent, and hath not broken her vows, she knows it. I reveal it unto you, my servant Joseph. Then you shall have power by power of the holy priesthood to take her and give her unto him that hath not committed adultery, but hath been faithful. Reader's note here, just in thinking on this doctrine. Um, and now it is clearly a corrupt representation. Make no bones about that. But the question becomes, remember that in many of these marriages, this was before, at least in many communities, perhaps we could say, this was before the idea that the state seized control of church. A church state became one. You had so much, you had a lot more liberty. In terms of marriage, it was strictly done within the church. And so a man and woman would be married by a priest. And then the local community would know that they're married. Okay, so you had none of this onerous contract that the state does today, and so on. I can understand why they may have adopted it, given the horrific kinds of stories like these in the 1800s. But the thing is that when you think of this idea of binding and loosing, and you, in particular, let's say, um, even someone who perhaps is the most rigid in their view of what constitutes a reasonably a well-reasoned reason for a man to release a woman. Uh, it's interesting that their practice was very similar to the Muslim practice, which is carried on today, to where without the state intervention, without this long contract that has to go through all kinds of lawyers before judges, the concept is, and in Islam, to simply declare in front of witnesses 3 times, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And it appears that this is a similar situation to how they basically would release a wife, such that she may go on to be another man's wife, as similar to that. And so, but you can clearly see selfishness, human, especially among the leadership, that they would create situations whereby they could get the desired result. And even if they abused their power, obviously it was happening left and right in this kind of community. And that's outside of the sheer immorality of it. Okay, W. Weil alleges that the prophet always carried a little bottle of holy oil about his person so that he might anoint any woman to be queen in heaven. Look at that one, to be queen in heaven, which honestly, queen in heaven is a bad title because remember the Israelites basically poured out drink offerings for the queen of heaven. It was a demonous entity. Maybe they didn't realize that. Who knows? The same passage tells of Joseph catching sight of a young married woman from his office window and sending a friend to request her to come to him, and he would have her sealed to himself this very moment. I went and told the woman to come to brother Joseph. She ran to the house to comb her hair and fix her generally, and then follow me to the prophet. I performed the sealing ceremony and retired. Here, the marriage at least preceded the enjoyment of his privileges. On another occasion, it is not even certain that any marriage ceremony was ever performed. Thus, in the case of Lucinda Harris, if ever there was a ceremony, quote, it took place in far west in Missouri in 1838 when the prophet was living in the Harris home. The marriage to Prescindia Huntington Buell is equally revealing. Her husband left the church for a time in 1838 to 9, around which period she bore a son who is usually regarded as being Joseph's. But she was not married officially to Joseph till December 1841. She remained nominally Miss Buell and lived with her official husband in Illinois until a year and a half of Joseph's death. Small wonder that Brodie refers to, quote, the extreme informality attending Joseph's earlier marriages. The woman appear to have required very little persuasion to become Joseph's spiritual wives. As Brodie observes, many of them found polyandry to their liking, although polyandry was anathema to the creed of saints. Nor was the system confined to Joseph, even if he was the main benefactor. Nauvoo was full of church widows whose husbands were abroad preaching the gospel, and many of these were drawn into spiritual wifery system. It is even asserted by the apostate John Hyde that something amounting to a levirate system prevailed, under which the absent husband was replaced by an officially appointed substitute in order to raise up seed where none would have otherwise have been produced. But this change seems to apply to a latter period. In the same way, the separated but undivorced female converts were flocking into Nauvoo at a time when the divorce was practically impossible, meant that their remarriage to a fellow convert had to be allowed. Such a step was the easier, since for Mormons a Gentile marriage was simply not valid. In any case, marriage on the frontier was always flexible. However, even if true, neither the alleged exercise of the levirate nor the liberal attitude adopted to marriages of undivorced female converts are central to the evolution of Mormon practice. The really significant development was the discovery by the prophet that the pleasures of marriage continued in heaven. The source of this innovation is the same as for spiritual wifehood. Swedenborg had written that in heaven as on earth there are males and females. Man was made for woman and woman for man. Love must unite them eternally, and there are marriages in heaven. Unquote. True, he denounces polygamy, but equally he emphasizes that, quote, the celestial spouses know pleasure. They have the utmost pleasures of conjugal love and much more delicious than mortals have because the senses of the spiritual body are incomparably more perfect, unquote. And readers note, again, a very similar pattern to Islam. And one wonders if Swedenborg, this writer, got his ideas from Islam because they believe a very similar thing. Joseph transformed these ideas into his conception of celestial marriage. He gave his conception a much more sensual and earthly direction and injected into it a dose of polygamy. Life in heaven was with a number of spiritual wives and not with just one, as in Swedenborg. Moreover, he set his pleasures in a hierarchical framework in which the prophet of the church and the other leaders would enjoy an exalted position side by side with their wives. This attitude is visible in the courtships of both Joseph and Brigham Young in 1842, when they tell their prospective bride that they will, quote, take her straight to the celestial kingdom, or, quote, make her a queen in heaven, unquote. This doctrine was elaborated in 1838 at the time when Joseph had chosen his first spiritual wife, Miss Harris, and was foreshadowed early in the following years to a second one, Presidia Huntington Buell, in a tender letter written when imprisoned by the Gentiles in Missouri. Its implications for the Mormon sect were vast, although initially it was taught only to a select handful of the elect. For to both men and women, it offered a combination of marriage on earth and marriage in heaven with different partners if they so wished. Hence, a man could not only practice polygamy in his earthly establishment, but could expand it still further in a celestial realm. Brigham Young, when admonishing wives reluctant to embrace polygamy, not only warned them that they would not follow their husband to glory, but that husbands so deprived of their earthly companion need have no fear of a replacement. Brother Joseph would provide. There are thousands in heaven. Have all you want, Joseph would tell them. The women, for their part, were allowed polyandry on a more modest scale, since they could have at most only two different husbands at all, one on earth and one in heaven. These corresponding in Mormon terminology to sealing for time and sealing for eternity. Reader's note here. Some may little wonder how it is that Joseph Smith happened to have such an iron control of all these people in the Mormon faith. And think of it. Think of the threat. If you have these men who are already married sent out to propagate the religion, if at any time they stepped out of line, guess what? Your wife back home could get polluted by an elder You see? Incredible power of control that was exerted here. And everything, the entire thing was uh, made up in order to basically, in their mind, they're trying to fix social problems of husbands being away from wives. And I can only imagine anyway. But it is incredibly convoluted when you think about it. And really, in some ways, it's tragically comical to think about this. Continuing on. This was the doctrine which Joseph began with extreme caution to impart to his inner circle of disciples from 1840 on. How much he stressed the spiritual wife aspect and how much he gave the teaching on Old Testament color, it is difficult to know. But its applications were certainly not confined to virgins. The fact that the doctrine was really an expansion of the spiritual wife philosophy explains what would otherwise be puzzling, the constant use of polygamy and spiritual wifehood in Mormon context, as if the two terms were interchangeable. Thus, Emma Smith was to deny, long after her husband's death, that there had ever been a revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. Unquote. Joseph himself is quoted as condemning just before he was murdered this doctrine of polygamy or spiritual wife system. Nor is the expression met with only in a general context. When wooing Miss Sarah Pratt, probably in the early 40s, Joseph revealed his intentions to her as follows. Quote, Sister Pratt, the Lord has given you to me as one of my spiritual wives, unquote. Higby, one of Law's companions in the campaign against the prophet, was accused by Joseph of having seduced three women, quote, under the spiritual wife code, unquote. And Joseph himself was charged with having sought to include the wives of Law, Foster, and Kimball among his spiritual wives. But the really crowning development of the spiritual wife theory was still to come. By stroke of genius, Joseph integrated celestial marriage into Old Testament polygamy and equated success in the afterlife with the number of wives and children. Those who complied with this command, he wrote, shall pass by the angels and the gods which are set there to their exaltation and glory in all things. He had already proclaimed the belief that, as a disciple put it, as man is now, God once was. As God is now, man may become. But the achievement of Godhead was made to depend on progeny. The theory made of sexuality a means to celestial glory. Procreation was given a central role in man's progress to divinity. All Mormon doctrine innovations were to fall into place around this new teaching on marriage. Reader's note here. And so that you see an incredible emphasis on the producing children, but they have no regard for the fact that a woman might get impregnated by different men. I suppose, to be fair, they would say at least two. There would be only two. There would be the spiritual husband and the physical husband. And they really didn't care because they wanted to simply propagate children. And they built in this, they had this baked in doctrinal view that the more children a person had, the higher they were in the celestial kingdom. And but it also, I'm sure, worked out in the physical, in the sense that by hook or by crook, they got a bunch of children in their communities, you see. And it's startling to consider from a psychological standpoint where the mind goes. Once you allow something, the domino falls. Another thing is allowed. The domino falls again. Another thing is allowed. And then pretty soon you can see it. It really led to the ruin of Joseph Smith. But in my analysis, the main failure of Joseph Smith is that he wanted to continue this secrecy. I can't help but wonder if he had simply come out and said, this is the doctrine that a man may have more than one wife, it would have undermined any of this foolishness that happened thereafter, because he never would have had to, it felt like he operated in secret all the time and create all of these elaborate kinds of things like spiritual wifery and so on. The one wonders. Continuing on, the theory was one of boundless optimism in line with a dynamic and expanding America, which saw before it a perpetually expanding frontier. It opened up the boundless opportunity for progression through eternity. But expansion in heaven was to be a strictly masculine prerogative, for clearly there could be no demonstrable addition to a man's family unless the strictest fidelity was preserved on the woman's part, and hence, unless polygamy on the Old Testament model was adopted, a study of the dates suggests, though the position is far from clear, that Joseph's revival of interest in the patriarchal way of life emerged at the same time, the spring of 1842, as his penchant for maidens. The new version of plural marriage had certainly been formulated by the beginning of the September of that year, since the revelation on baptism for the dead hints at it repeatedly, logically enough. Since a forward linkage, parents and children, is inseparable from a backward one, parents and their dead parents. Let me read that again. That was kind of a confusing sentence. The new version of plural marriage had certainly been formulated by the beginning of September of that year, since the revelation on baptism for the dead hints at it repeatedly, logically enough, since a forward linkage, parents and children, is inseparable from a backward one, parents and their dead parents, unquote. Interesting here. Very similar doctrine in the Catholic Church, the idea of prayers for the dead, or baptism for the dead, too, kept by the Catholic Church even today. And in many ways, it seems like Joseph Smith had an amalgamation of many different influences to concoct this area. It's really quite a bizarre doctrine, isn't it? If this hypothesis is correct, the chain of cause and effect is as bizarre as an historical caprice ever produced. A powerful libido, a pursuit of married women in order to avoid obviously illegitimate pregnancies, an enrichment of the spiritual wife theory, the discovery of abortive techniques, and of the joys of renewing old age in the society of maidens. All these were stirred into a new mix with Puritanism as a basic ingredient. The result was a new religion which mysteriously more and more resembled a 400-year-old tradition, that of the Munsterites, who had made of the beginning of righteous seed the essence of their creed. Reader's note here. Yeah, in reading about the Munsterites, they got really, really loose with the morality, didn't they? But I'm not sure they ever approached the kind of looseness that Joseph Smith concocted. The element of spiritual wifehood had been basic to the preparation of this banquet was discarded as an alien accretion, as is hardly surprising. Spiritual wives made strange bedfellows with the grave patriarchs of the gospel. They fall into place only if set side by side with a host of other movements which, confusedly but unmistakably, strove to emancipate women from household drudgery and excessive childbearing. There were the perfectionists, the harmonists, it looks like Fourierists and the Shakers, for example, who preached either equality of the sexes, male abstinence, birth control, free love, or several of these combined. In a Puritan community such as that of the Mormons, polygamy could only secure acceptance and be publicly proclaimed if it were presented in the most austere garb. As with the Munsterites, a severe sexual code already existed, but it was monogamic. Joseph's formulation of polygamy had not quite converged with that ethos by the time he died. In his courtship of Nancy Rigdon in 1842, his only biblical reference is to the exuberance of Solomon's harem. By the following year, when he wrote down his revelation, he was quoting the example of the patriarchs, which justifies a man in marrying as many virgins as he pleases. But the new doctrine stressed the importance of numerous progeny, forces him to add, quote, for the exaltation in the eternal worlds, that they may bear the souls of men, unquote. The next step was the revelation of the new doctrine to the community and its elaboration as a new code of sexual morality. This operation was to fall to Joseph's successor, Brigham Young. His task was not to prove too difficult. The stage had been set for the introduction of Puritan polygamy. So we've completed that chapter. Now we have chapter 11, and plural wives, which is going to go into all of the escapades of Brigham Young, it looks like. I think I'm going to stop there because there's a lot here to digest. I think it goes without saying that if there's any example of how not to conduct oneself with the introduction of scriptural allowances of marriage, then we might easily point to Joseph Smith, and perhaps we could say to a lesser degree the Munsterites.